everyone. It's great to see you all. And Jesse, it's good to see you again. I feel like every couple of years we go on a stage and we talk about what's happening with Zoox. So thanks.
Here we are again.
Yeah, here we are again.
We still exist.
Yes. Well, actually, that's a pretty considerable feat in the world of AVs to still be existing. Zoox was founded 10 years ago. 4 years ago, Amazon acquires Zoox. Also 4 years ago, and a few months after the acquisition, you unveil the custom-built robotaxi. Here we are a decade in, and so I have to ask, first question, what is taking so long?
It's hard, right? It's a really, really hard problem. And when we started Zoox 10 years ago, it's not like we thought it was easy, especially given that our strategy has always been to build our own vehicle from scratch that is truly a robotaxi with no steering wheel and no pedals, and that did not sound easy. But we would not have predicted it would take quite this long or this much money. And I think the whole industry 10 years ago, such as it was then, but even probably 5 or 6 years ago, underestimated the difficulty of truly putting a driverless vehicle in a city. And it's hard, but the good news is it's not impossible, right? And so you see it finally happening now. You see a few companies that have managed to put driverless vehicles on public roads, and we're excited to be one of them, and actually the only one that's doing it with a purpose-built robotaxi with no manual controls.
Yeah, the purpose-built robotaxi is an interesting choice because it immediately stands out, certainly as a brand, but it is more expensive, potentially. Okay, we'll ask about that. And also, you're dealing with potential regulatory barriers as well. So were there ever moments early on, and maybe even more recently, like in the last 4 years when Amazon acquired you, where there was a discussion about whether to continue down the road of a custom-built robotaxi that has bidirectional driving and no steering wheel, no pedals?
I would say in the early years, there were discussions, not so much to the level of like, maybe we shouldn't do this, but it was a very popular criticism of Zoox, right? It still is a little bit, but in the early years, it was like lots of people we talked to, whether it was investors or prospective employees, were like, you guys are nuts. Like, this is way too complicated, way too expensive. Why can't, cars drive, why can't you just make them drive themselves? And so we've spent pretty much, this last decade trying to explain to people without really being able to show them why it's so much better and so much safer and so much more reliable and so much more enjoyable to have a vehicle that was truly designed for riders and not to be driven by a human. And there are so many aspects of that, right? From the safety, redundancy, battery sizing, interior experience, product features, that when you put that all together, it was very obvious to us way back in 2014 and only increasing since then, that that's a fundamentally better, safer, actually more economical product. Because you mentioned it was more expensive, and actually building the thing is a bit more expensive, although probably not as much as people might expect. But the important thing is, remember, we're not selling it. We're not selling these robotaxis to people. We are selling rides. And so when you amortize the cost of the robotaxi over all the rides that it can provide, and then you look at, again, like, the battery size and the redundancy and the reliability, it actually is not more expensive. It's less expensive, and it's better. And that's why we're spending all this time and money designing this thing, because it is a much better product.
When you talk about the cost, the metric are you using it as over time? Because I have to imagine that considerable money went into the R&D and just development. I mean, are you including that in your figure?
Yes, in the long run, right? So right now we spend a lot of money and don't make any money. So far it's, not paid for itself. The whole point is that the market opportunity is so huge, so much money is spent on ground transportation, moving people around cities, that upfront investment that we took on and now that Amazon's taking on, the expectation is that will more than pay for itself in the medium to long term with this great product.
Give me an estimate or a range of what a robotaxi costs. I know that some of the figures out there for Waymo and others I've heard are several $100,000, and it just depends on who you hear it from. So how does that compare to that figure?
Well, I can't really share specifics. I will
Sure
say
you
that
can, Jesse.
I will say that our robotaxi will cost less than the number you just mentioned.
Okay.
So that's good, but it's definitely more expensive than a car. I don't want to pretend like it costs what a car costs. It's when you put the dual steering racks, the dual motors, dual brakes, the sensor pods on each corner, the compute, like that is more than what's in a car. So it absolutely costs us more than a car. But if you look at what it costs us per mile, given that we can drive so much more than a privately owned car, then all of a sudden that math looks really, really great. And that's why we're doing this.
We talked a little bit ago about when do you personally, as co-founder and CTO of Zoox, but also the company, know when is it safe enough to deploy commercially? Obviously, there are regulatory hurdles and permissions that you have to get to be able to do that. But when is the moment, and has Zoox reached that?
That is the existential question, right? When you're working on this technology, is how do you know it's safe enough? And while there is a relatively robust regulatory framework for things like, how do you make a car and what's legal to put in a car, there's less in terms of, when is an autonomous technology safe enough to deploy without a driver? And so what we've been trying to do at Zoox is actually set the bar for that in the industry. And we have a very comprehensive, what we call a safety case, which really looks at, if we put a particular piece of hardware in a particular environment with some software running on it, how safe will that be? And we have to rely on millions and millions of miles of test data, plus way more than that of simulation, plus all kinds of system engineering and functional safety and hazard analysis and all these things to really build this concrete quantitative safety case. And our internal bar is that the vehicle needs to be many, many times better than humans at not causing collisions, injuries, and fatalities, like multiple times better. And what we're really excited to actually share today is that we are now ready to deploy our robotaxi in San Francisco and on the Las Vegas Strip within the next couple of weeks, because we have achieved that internal safety readiness, and we're really excited for everybody to start seeing them out
You
here.
got a single woo and claps out there? So let's break that down. Because I've spent, anyone who's spent any time, who here has been in a Waymo this week or any time? Yeah, okay. So we've just seen Waymos on the road. We did see Cruise out there for a bit, but now we don't. When are we going to see and where are we going to see the custom-built Zoox robotaxi in San Francisco?
It's literally within the next couple of weeks. And this is not like the OpenAI coming weeks that's like many, many months or forever. This is like the next couple of weeks. We're going to be in Soma in particular. So if you're around Soma, a couple weeks from now, you will start seeing our custom Zoox robotaxi, no steering wheel, no pedals, carriage seating, driving itself, sometimes with riders in it, sometimes empty, in Soma in San Francisco. And on the Las Vegas Strip, if you happen to be in Las Vegas.
And in Las
the
Vegas
entire strip, all the way up and down.
In San Francisco, when are we, the public, going to be able to get into this? Because I imagine that you won't, and maybe you will, open it up to the public immediately. Are you going to take a more measured, phased approach to this?
We are going to take a measured approach. And I think that's one of the things that most of our fellow travelers have done well. And it's for a few reasons. First of all, we don't have hundreds of robotaxis ready to deploy, and we're not covering all of San Francisco just yet. Of course, that's our goal, but we're going to start in the Soma region and then expand from there out. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have this concept of Zoox Explorers. They're going to be our early riders who get to try the robotaxi without paying, and we're going to be announcing more about that earlier in the year, so early next year. How do you become a Zoox Explorer? And so in the meantime, you can sign up for a newsletter, and then you'll be the first to hear about our wait list. But yes, there will be a period where we have these Zoox Explorers, and then after that, then we will open up more broadly and eventually be able to charge for rides in all of San Francisco and the whole core of Las Vegas.
When you first start in Soma in the next couple of weeks, are you going to, a jargon word that is often thrown around is geofence, and that could mean a lot of things. That could mean a specific geographic area where you allow the driverless vehicle to operate, but it could also mean time of day. So are you going to start by operating it only in the daytime or only in the nighttime? And, what's the downside of doing it all at once? I mean, obviously there's a potential safety case, but if you want to be able to test it in any condition in SOMA, in that geofence, why not just do that?
Yeah, so great question. Our safety case covers 24 hours a day, right? So we've tested with our test fleet all day, all night. Our simulations cover daytime and nighttime. And so when we deploy, it will not be time of day restricted. We probably will not be operating at 4 in the morning, only because it's so boring at 4 in the morning. We don't think we would learn very much. So we're doing the opposite of the let's do it when nobody's around. We're going to drive when people are out there because our safety case is ready for that. And we'll be operating about 16 hours a day in San Francisco, but the most busy 16 hours a day.
Okay. One thing that for some reason, a lot of AV companies don't love talking about, which is all the humans behind the scenes, and this sort of idea that it's magic and it just happens on its own. Talk to me about what Zoox specifically does in terms of the human beings in the background. Sometimes it's called remote guidance, sometimes it's correctly or incorrectly, depending, called teleops. What is the Zoox approach in terms of handling the vehicles when and if they come across a situation that the system isn't able to handle? Maybe it's confused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've, I think, probably been the most transparent of any company in the space. We recently invited New York Times into we call it our Fusion Center, where we actually do the teleguidance. And we're not shy about admitting that that is part of our stack. And in fact, it always will be. I mean, always, at least for a decade plus. The only way you can truly eliminate that is if you have an AI on the vehicle that really is better than humans at essentially anything that could ever happen. And who knows when that's going to happen, and we don't need it to, right? So the idea is our vehicles are on the network. They're driving themselves, so this is important, right? No human ever remotely drives our vehicle. The AI is always in control, but when the AI needs help, which is very, very rare, right? It's on the order of 1% of the time that the AI might ask for help. There's a human available to give guidance. So it might, for example, drop some breadcrumbs. It might say, hey, you have permission to do this thing that normally you wouldn't do. And that is really important, right? Because it means that the AI is always in charge. It's always keeping the vehicle safe. It's always making sure it doesn't run into anything. But if semantically there's something very unusual, there's a human available to help the vehicle get through that situation. And what's kind of cool is oftentimes that doesn't even require the vehicle to come to a stop. It may be fully transparent. The teleguider can actually provide guidance while the vehicle's in motion if necessary. So it's minimally disruptive and rarely even noticeable to a passenger in the vehicle, but it does provide that extra layer of safety and redundancy that we think is important.
And so people should be thinking about this. These are essentially software commands, like a rules-based.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
A couple more specific questions about SOMA and Vegas deployment, just initially at least. In Vegas, my understanding is that it's going to go up and down the strip, you said, but is it going to have multiple stops? And are you going to do the same thing in SOMA, or are these going to be more of predetermined hubs, if you will, points where it stops, at least initially?
Yeah, so it's kind of in between, I would say. It's a little bit of a hybrid, right? Eventually, you'll be able to use the app and sort of drop a pin anywhere, and it will take you as close to that pin as possible. The app actually does work that way now, but we don't have hundreds of possible pickup and drop-off locations within those geofences. It's a little bit more limited for now. We are also working with many of the major resort properties up and down the Las Vegas Strip so that we can actually pick up and drop off passengers at their main hotel entrances, which no other autonomous vehicle has done autonomously before. So we're not ready to share which hotels those are, but we're not going to just be driving up and down the strip. We're also going to be able to pick up and drop off people at hotels, and we're going to start with a couple and then kind of try to quickly expand that so that eventually we can drive anywhere.
Yeah, so from now into the drive anywhere moment, how do you see that playing out in San Francisco and in Vegas? And is it different? I mean, two totally different cities, different speed levels. Mm-hmm. Vegas has these big boulevards with fewer pedestrians, so you have to do speed. So do you see one expanding and deploying faster or at a greater rate than the other?
It's a great question. We're really focused on both. We're going to do Las Vegas a little bit earlier from a commercial perspective. So our Zoox Explorers will actually start earlier next year in Las Vegas, and then San Francisco will come a little bit later. And one of the reasons for that is Las Vegas is a great city to deploy a smaller commercial fleet because of the major resorts, and that's actually something that's kind of commercially interesting. In San Francisco, if your geofence is small, that's not a very useful service, right? So we're really excited to be in San Francisco in the next couple of weeks, but we also acknowledge that our first iteration in San Francisco wouldn't be a commercially useful product to very many people. Does that make sense? So the goal then is to expand as quickly as we can safely do so in both locations, so that ultimately we can offer a true ride-hailing service in both cities. And we also announced a few months ago that we are expanding as well into Austin and Miami. And in just the last couple of months, we've started autonomously driving our retrofitted test vehicles in both of those cities as well.
How large do you anticipate, how many Zooxes are we going to see this time next year in San Francisco?
Oh, this time next year?
Yeah.
Pretty good number. I can say that in the next few weeks, we're actually going to have a couple dozen Zoox robotaxis across our Foster City, San Francisco, and Las Vegas geofences. That will expand several fold over the next year. And then, 2026 is when we're going to really start cranking out production vehicles at very large scale, and that will be exciting too. So it'll be a nice ramp.
Nice ramp. All right.
We've got a couple people are excited for 2026.
Where are these vehicles going to be produced once you do the volume production? Like, is that going to be handled by a contract manufacturer, Zoox, Amazon?
We actually do it ourselves, which is really cool. So we have facilities in Fremont and Hayward where we actually put these things together. We call it final assembly, which is kind of like manufacturing but a little different. And the distinction is, unlike a traditional car company, they'll have like a body shop and a paint shop and really tooling up for making 500,000 or 1 million of these things. Our volumes are going to be a bit less than that, at least in the coming years, because the utilization of a robotaxi is so much higher than of a car, and we're not trying to sell them to people as we discussed. So we have the facilities to produce tens of thousands of our own robotaxis, which is really cool. But we do get a lot of the components from suppliers all over the world, and then we kind of put them together. So it's not quite as involved of a manufacturing process as a regular car, but it's still very sophisticated. We're very excited for that. In fact, I was actually just at our new facility yesterday, and it's coming along. We're going to start producing our first vehicles from there in the next couple of months. So it's really exciting, and we're very proud to be making these vehicles right here in the Bay Area.
2026 sounds like the year where it really kind of ramps up and explodes. So what does the Zoox world look like in 2026? Are you specifically going to be commercially operating by then? In California, that matters. It means getting the final deployment permit from the CPUC. Mm-hmm. Will you be commercially deployed in Miami and Austin, or will you still be testing by then?
I'm pretty excited about all of those things. So I don't want to be too specific, but I would certainly hope that we're very commercial in multiple places at some scale by then, yes.
Okay, I'm going to translate it as, yes, you are going to be commercially deployed in all those areas. All right, well, I do want to back up a little bit because you did go through this process of the design of this vehicle. There is one hiccup there, which is, it is very jargony, but in federal regulations called FMVSS, we're required to have things like a steering wheel and an airbag and a steering wheel. And for vehicles or companies that don't do that, they have to get an exemption. And as far as I know, the only company that's ever got that exemption is Neuro, which isn't bringing people around. Zoox's position, unless it's changed, my understanding is that you're going to go ahead and deploy and that you haven't received that exemption and it's not necessary. So is that still the position? And aren't you worried that federal regulators will get involved and then kind of put a pause or halt on your exciting news today?
So we've actually been working really closely with regulators, including at NHTSA, and being very transparent Actually, we first met with them in 2016, and we've been very, very transparent with them that we want to use the regulatory framework they laid out to certify that our vehicle is compliant with the federal motor vehicle safety standards. Now, we are the only company in the world that has built a robotaxi that is FMVSS compliant. And to your point, that's not a trivial thing to do. We've spent an incredible amount of money and time and people complying with the FMVSS regulations as they are. And because there aren't traditional manual controls, in some cases that requires interpreting them in a way that is relevant to a robotaxi, which NHTSA has been very clear that they do want to allow robotaxis. They want it to be possible to have vehicles without drivers on American roads. That's very important for safety. It's important for American competitiveness. And so we've taken the time to design a robotaxi that is FMVSS compliant. And we're still talking to them. They've had some questions about, what about this one and this one? We are very actively engaged with them, but yes, it is absolutely our position that our vehicle is fully FMVSS compliant, and we are very proud of that.
Next year, or actually in a couple of weeks, we'll see Zoox vehicles out here, but you've said that it will continue to scale and we'll see more and more. This time next year, are we also going to see Tesla robotaxis deployed on the streets of San Francisco or anywhere in California?
Without a driver?
Without a driver.
No.
Okay, explain why. Because we talked about this a little bit not too long ago. Is it a regulatory problem that they're facing? Because they haven't even really started the process. And, for those who are unaware, Waymo, Zoox, many others have taken years to go through that process. Or is it an actual technology problem?
It's all of the above, right? I mean, there are a lot of regulatory hurdles that they haven't even started trying to climb yet. But I don't think that's their most fundamental problem, right? I think they will, if they had technology that worked, I'm quite confident they could go through the regulatory steps. The more fundamental issue is they don't have technology that works. And by works, I want to differentiate between a driver assistance system that drives most of the time, except when it doesn't and then you have to take over, versus a system that's so reliable and robust that you don't need a person in it. You don't need a person paying attention. And there are several orders of magnitude difference in safety between those two systems in terms of what the requirements are. So they have an impressive system. I drive a Tesla. I play with FSD every couple of weeks. I do find it a bit stressful because, again, usually it does the right thing and then it sort of lulls you into this false sense of complacency and then it does the wrong thing. You're like, oh my God. They're about 100 times less safe than a human if you look at all the metrics that are publicly available. That's a huge gap, right? It's not like, oh, another 20% or another 40%. And so they have a profound gap. And it's because we just don't, as a society, have the technology that can take cameras, feed them into a computer, and drive as safely as a human. That doesn't exist yet. And it's not close to existing. And on top of that, it is our fundamental belief that a robotaxi should not only be as safe as a human, but significantly safer, because I think that the public has a lower tolerance for robotaxis doing bad things than for humans doing bad things. And I think that's fair. So our perspective is you really do need significantly more hardware than Tesla's putting in their vehicles to build a robotaxi that's not just as safe, but especially safer than a human.
So to your point, is it just a hardware problem, or is there something fundamentally happening in terms of their approach? This is the AI stage, so their approach, and they talk a lot about end-to-end and neural networks. Is that flawed? Because there is a new wave of companies out there, Wave being one of them, that have raised a lot of money that are going after that approach.
Yeah, so first of all, obviously there are incredibly exciting things happening in machine learning and large models and transformers, and we are using all of those technologies. We're not just like sitting here pretending it's 2015. But you do need more sensor data. Even despite the advances in AI, if you give these large models lots of camera data, they do pretty well and it's very exciting, except when they don't do well. And we've all played with, GPT and Claude, and sometimes you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. And sometimes you're like, how could you be so dumb, right? We've had both experiences. That doesn't work in a self-driving car. You can't have it 99% of the time be awesome and 1% of the time drive into stuff. That doesn't work. So we don't have technology that is capable of doing that. And there's also a fundamental lack of what we call system engineering and functional safety. You have to be able to handle corner cases, including what happens when your own hardware fails, right? Like what if one of the sensors gets dirty? If you drive a Tesla, you're very familiar with the little warning that says, front camera blinded or obscured or dirty. That's fine if there's a human. Okay, now the human drives, great. What if there isn't a human? So it's just fundamentally not designed that way. And these new end-to-end techniques, while again, there's a lot of promise in them, and we're using components of that, do prevent you from having a system that you can kind of certify, that you can easily change without having to retrain this giant model. And so I just think while it's very compelling to build an ADAS system that way or to make a demo that way, it's not the way to build a safe robotaxi that you can deploy at scale in real cities, at least not anytime soon.
Well, we could sit here all day because I have about 20 more questions for you, but we will have to leave it there. Thank you again, Jesse, for joining us once again on the TechCrunch stage.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks all for you listening in. All right.